Today's guest is a licensed counsellor, trauma educator, and IFS practitioner who is passionate about helping people recover from relational trauma and dysfunctional family dynamics. You might know her from Instagram, where she shares information on healing and the healing journey with over 100,000 followers. I loved this conversation. Today's guest is Sarah Ann LaFleur, and we are talking about inner validation and parts work, integration work. I loved this conversation because I feel like she held the two parts of being both a licensed counselor and also a coach and a creative and a woman who's living her own story really, really well. I hope that you get a lot from this episode. If you do, if you enjoy it, please let her know, please let me know, and please share it with a friend who you think could benefit from this episode. Thank you so much. Let me know how you get on. Enjoy.
You are listening to Adulting with Ebony. Season 7 brings together neurodiversity, human design, and embodiment so that Gen X or millennial misfits and late diagnosed neurospices become empowered, embodied, and fully expressed. This is the show where I actively encourage you to feel your feelings rather than think them. Glow up, not grow up, and become full of yourself. Because who the fuck else should you be full of? Each week, I have real and raw conversations about what it takes to be fully resourced and have happy, healthy, intimate relationships as a dopamine-deficient adult wanting to create a better future by being the change that you want to see in the world. I am your host, Ebony Allard, aka Ebony Alchemy, a late diagnosed ADHDer, combined type and Asperger's in case you like specifics, artist, mystic, and self-actualization facilitator. I'm an international award-winning multiple brain integration technique master coach with special interest in embodied human design for neurodivergence. I've been in the personal development, creativity, and entrepreneurship spaces all of my life, and as a 5'2" emotional manifesting generator with a left angle cross of distraction, I am here to help you know what to trust and what to tune out. Each week, I share relatable, practical ways that mean you get to take less responsibility for more reward and safely remove your camouflage for more belonging, acceptance, and fulfillment. Ready? Let's go. Hey, my love, thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation with me.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
I'm excited because we are going to talk a little bit about parts integration, a little bit about inner validation. And for me, those are two of working with those themes, looking at that stuff. That and interoception have changed my life the most and enabled me to adult the most. And so that's why I reached out to you. And when you said yes, I was like, oh yes, we get to have a conversation. It's going to help so many people.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, these are my favorite subjects to talk about. And I agree with you too, that those practices have been, at least for me personally, most helpful. Of course, there's other practices that I think are important for trauma recovery and for kind of finding yourself. But I feel like parts work in particular, it gives you this level of depth and this dimension to your process that other modalities don't always speak to. So really excited to talk about it.
And I kind of feel like for me, at least my journey into that kind of work was recognizing that I have all of these voices inside of my head, or that there are these different parts of myself. And one of the things I talk about quite a lot in my work is nuance and holding more than one truth. And the first person that I needed to be able to hold more than one truth for was myself. Like, how can I possibly hold more than one truth for my mum or for some difficult stuff that I've been through or out in the world generally, if I can't first acknowledge that there are multiple truths and multiple perspectives, even within me? Does that make sense to you?
Oh, it makes total sense. Yeah. In IFS, we would call that self-leadership, or in DBT, it's dialectics. And I think with IFS and parts work, because you're accessing your parts, it's so apparent that there's so many different worlds that can exist in one emotional experience. And it's like once you start attuning to that, it becomes easier to pick up on parts in other people and just realize, okay, this isn't the full them. They're in a defense right now, and I can give them grace for that.
Do you feel like this is again when I was young and I used to look at adults, I really believed that there was this like binary line that one day I would cross and I would go from being a child to being an adult. And I remember in high school, I had a friend who had an older sister and she'd just gone to university, and I was like, oh, she's such an adult. And she must have been about 18, right? And I am 43 and I am yet to find that place where all of a sudden I tripped from being like a young person or from being an innocent or whatever to being an adult. Did you
Yeah.
also have that belief when you were younger?
Yeah, and just listening to you talk about it, I'm like, okay, good. I'm 33 and I haven't found that line yet. I'm not the only one.
And so the more I do this work and the more I, work with different modalities and investigate and all of that, I don't think like my definition of what an adult is has changed fundamentally, because I don't think that that line exists. I don't think it's binary. I don't think it's like child, adult, right? And
Right.
that's, I guess for me, that's one of the ways that integrating parts, looking from different perspectives, having these different conversations is really helpful, because we can look at being a healthy, happy, reasonable person, human, rather than it always being about like higher self or adult or, those kind of pedestaled versions.
Right. Exactly. That really resonates with me because I think there can be this binary understanding of like being immature or acting young versus being an adult. And the way that I look at it now is when I'm in my adult awareness or in this place of self, I'm in touch with everything that came before that's alive in this current experience. And I'm always going to have young parts. I'm always going to have adolescent parts. And the older I get, the more I see them. And I'm like, oh, this is my, just actually before I logged on here with you, I had a little tiff with my husband because he was dragging his feet out the door and I had like a little temper tantrum moment. It's like, okay, this is my 13-year-old part that is nervous about this conversation, wants to have her way the way she wants it. And I think like adulting is really just learning to spot those parts and meet them where they're at and fulfill their needs in ways that they may not have been fulfilled before, especially in instances of trauma.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the reasons I try and put real language to it also is that when people say shadow work or they say reparenting work or they talk about, parts integration, for the average person, that can feel really jargony, right? And really therapeutic and so far from them. And I do think those spaces and that work and having something very outlined is beautiful and wonderful and important. And I think a lot of us have potentially done more than we give ourselves credit for.
Yeah,
Do you see that?
I do. I need to sit with what you're saying because I really appreciate the way that you think and you're kind of outlining that. And I'm just seeing also like the nuance and holding both perspectives
Yeah.
where I too, as like an IFS therapist, I'm
Yeah.
trained in this and I love concepts. I love language. I love the jargon sometimes, but then there also are parts of me that care deeply about making things relatable, which is why I've always like had a social media platform and I want to meet people where they're at. And I think sometimes we can become overly attached to and overcomplicate these concepts that are really just part of the natural human experience, which is, we're always carrying the past with us. We're always carrying that forward. And there's always an opportunity in the present moment to kind of like transform or transmute that. And that's self-actualization to me, not to take this into a whole other
No.
conversation. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's
You
what it's about.
totally did. And for me, like self-actualization is adulting. Like it's the purpose of all of my work of why we would bother. Like why would we go into this place? Like why would I continue dialoguing with my inner 2-year-old who I've been mostly telling to hurry up and like, oh, you're so annoying, right? Like why would I ever find the time to just love her and cuddle her and like be with this car unless there was self-actualization at the end of it, right?
Yeah.
Like there has to be some kind of carrot for us, some kind of reward that we talk to. I
Mm.
think in in suggesting that, or like saying it, I'm actually thinking of a particular client who I'd been working with for a long time, and who then came very excitedly to session one day to say that she was about to spend a lot of money with somebody to do some shadow work. And I was like, we've been doing shadow work for like X amount of time. And it's that like sometimes there is I have definitely in my life worked with and done processes in a really sacred, really outlined, really contained way. Always with professionals. My dad's a registered psychotherapist. I've always, done that. I really appreciate people who have certifications, all of that. And I also think there is little pieces of everyday shadow work, little pieces of everyday integration work that doesn't need to be a big deal, right?
Yes. Ooh, I just want to like jump up in my seat. That resonates with me so much. And just to speak to one of my professional experiences. So I'm a trauma addiction relationship therapist, trained in IFS, but I work in residential treatment for people struggling with substance use disorders, right? And at the beginning of this particular job, I would consult with IFS program directors, certified therapists, et cetera. And at one point I met with an IFS therapist who told me, you really can't be doing IFS in that setting. You can't be doing pure or real IFS, because in residential treatment, there's a lot of dual roles that clinicians hold. Like I work with a client differently in that setting than I would in private practice, or I would in a coaching container. I have access, it's a multidisciplinary team. There's different regulations for the place. I won't go into details. But the point being, I realized at that point that like specialization and depth is really important, but so is integration. And so is like, if your model isn't able to work with a diverse amount of people and really like meet them where they're at and appreciate those small moments, then I don't find that to be a functional model or a robust model. And I don't think that's the truth of IFS. I think that was actually a therapist part coming up that was speaking for something that they felt in relationship to the model. But anyway, I think that we can put this emphasis on parts work, shadow work, integration work, and make it this big thing when really it could be like, I'm going to write in my journal and talk about what's coming up for me. And that's actually a way for me to access my system. Or, I'm going to get on a podcast and like have a really engaging dialogue. And like, this is kind of parts work in a way, because it's meeting one of my parts where it's at. And there can be something deeply creative and expressive about it, not just like this really internal trauma work, which there is a use for that, but it's not the only use or expression.
It's really nice and really refreshing, I think, because again, that's holding like a bigger perspective, right? Like, it's, for me, there are times and using a model in a clinician basis or in a clinic setting is totally different from having that awareness within yourself, using it with your own 2-year-old around yourself, so that you don't actually, end up mirroring a 2-year-old and can hold that space for them. That's a totally different thing. And I think sometimes we put these things just in like a particular setting or a particular place. And for me, mastery is like, so what? What are the implications and applications of us doing this work anyway, right? Like, what is the legacy of it? How do we go further than that? And I think I said to you, I really want you to come on and I want to talk about relationship and I want to talk about inner validation. And I think what I'm trying to say is, imagine if the next generation grew up with some of this being so natural that they didn't have this deep inner validation wound that I see more and more young people having every single day. And potentially we found it easier, or there were things that we could do now that would make it easier for people to relate.
Yeah. I mean, that would be beautiful.
I'm such an idealist. But I guess it's the difference between like medicine, like preventative and cure medicine, right? It's like I want to be offering both at the same time, and I hear you about the conversation that you had with that therapist, right? They are really in a treatment place. But I feel like we can do preventative care and treatment at the same time.
Right. Exactly.
Mm. So let's take this to relationship stuff and inner validation. Like for you, even if I'm saying inner validation, like what does that mean to you in a kind of everyday terms? Like how do you see people coming in or in life who could really do with some work around I mean, in my world, it's like not looking outside of them constantly for validation, but just so
Right.
we're on the same page about what it is that we're talking about.
Yeah. So I think your definition fits really well my working definition of inner validation. And to use parts language, I would say it's the ability to acknowledge your parts and acknowledge what's happening in your system. And um, Richard Schwartz, the founder of IFS, he describes self-leadership as being the primary caretaker of your system. And so in a healthy relationship, of course, we're going to outsource sometimes. We're going to borrow our partner's self energy. We're going to borrow their calm autonomic energy. And that's part of healthy relationship. But you don't want to rest on that, because the reality is nobody can give you perfect attunement all the time. Even if they want to, they won't, because circumstances of life don't allow for that. And then I think inner validation is important for everybody, but I also think it's especially important for people who have experienced trauma, because trauma inherently disrupts that connection to your internal experience. And so there's going to be a fractured disconnect that needs repairing. And part of that repairing is learning to just allow your experience to be what it is and have awareness of it. And also for people, which I think might align with some of your interests, but people who are neurocomplex or neurodivergent, whatever term kind of feels aligned for people in that category, because oftentimes, I mean, if you even look at research in the last several decades, like there are people now in this generation being diagnosed with things like autism and ADHD who completely flew under the radar for 2, 3, 4, 5 decades.
Yeah.
And so they've never had their processing style like acknowledged on the outside. And so if we can become skilled in knowing like how we think, how we organize information, how we assemble it, how we express it, then we have more of an opportunity to form relationships that feel nourishing. Which sometimes can put us in educator roles in our relationships, which isn't fun. But I also think like we have a responsibility to our system to do that.
I love everything you just said. As someone who went under the radar for 4 decades, the reason for that actually is because I grew up in a household where, without using this language, but interoception and somatic experiencing and my own experience and my autonomy and my sovereignty were honored every single day. And so I never knew that I was different, or there was never anything wrong with that, because the people around me, the adults around me, always lived under the assumption that everybody's experience was different. What was hard was school and work and mainstream society, right? Where I was just constantly wrong. And so I had these two parts, these two truths. And I carry that with me into the work that I do now, and the way that I live my life, right? That there has been a huge piece of work for me around, first of all, recognizing and doing my own inner leadership work, and then stopping being a constant educator for everybody in my life and being like, no, I'm going to look after me.
Right.
And that's what I have. I'm going to stop trying to be responsible for everybody in the world and model instead of teach, potentially.
Right. Yeah. And also knowing, giving yourself permission to not do that is part of inner leadership, and recognizing like, if I know my truth and I know my experience, I don't have to share that with anybody else or help them understand that process if I don't want to, or if it's not right for me.
Yeah, I think that's what they call giving no fucks on the internet, right? Like that whole thing of like, and my clients will have heard me say, you do you, boo, right? Like for me, there's this place where I suddenly get to where it is calm, where it never used to be, where I was still somewhere seeking approval. I didn't know that. And again, I really differentiate for myself between self-approval and self-acceptance. And I had no idea that I was looking for, even in this kind of integration piece and in this investigation piece, that I was looking for self-approval. And the shift from that into self-acceptance for me was the piece that really allowed me to have this inner validation that we're talking about.
Yeah.
But I have no idea how I did it. So like if other people are like, yes, but how? How do you do this? How do we move into a place of maturity and inner validation? Any insights?
Well, I actually have a follow-up question with that, but
Yeah.
a wondering as well. So do you think any piece of that has to do with being neurodivergent? Because I find too that, at least I'll speak for myself, like having ADHD, it's like I used to think some of the parts of me that I really struggled with, I needed to change them, or like if only I could figure out how to, if only they could be a little bit different, then I could meet certain goals and everything would be okay. And it's like the older I get year by year, I relax into myself and I realize, for example, like I'm always going to ideate. I'm always going to have a million projects in diverse fields that I'm somehow going to tie together. And that's just part of how I find meaning in life. It's part of how I exercise this like intellectual restlessness. And that part doesn't need to change, but it gets easier to just identify that within myself. So I feel like even if you're not actively working on yourself, if you're, I don't know, even if you're not actively working on yourself, just by being with you for X amount of time, you're going to become more skilled at being with you. So do you think any of that just has to do with either the natural process of aging or being neurodivergent?
I have nothing else to compare it to. So I'm like, I don't know. But what came up for me as you were saying that is I had a conversation. I have had many conversations with my dad, who likes to have conversations and likes to think in the same way as I do. And there are other people in my family who do not need or have any desire to think and to contemplate and to philosophize anywhere near as much as the pair of us, right? And that is a part of me that I love. It's a part of me that I enjoy. And when I hear, sometimes when people take ADHD meds, for example, that bit goes and it's really sad for people, right? So there is, for me, part of this journey is learning who you are and learning to love and accept the parts that you love and accept, and change the parts that you don't or accept them. And that journey of like, which bits do I want to change and which bits are just, okay, actually, that's life. I think that's the point of living, right? I think the point of living is the journey. And the conversations that I have had with my dad, he loves to tell me, you like hooks. He actually said, you like to put things in boxes. And I'm like, no, I need hooks and baskets, right? Like I just need to have, I'm like, oh, that fits with that. That fits with that. Things need to make sense to me. There needs to be some kind of an order. And what my diagnosis did for me was give me a category that had been missing, right? Like this is a massive internal filing system. And I had done so much work on myself and go, that belongs there, like, right? And then there was this kind of odd sock drawer of stuff that I'm like, I see no model for this. I don't understand it. It makes no sense to me. It's confusing me. Then I got my diagnosis, which is a dual diagnosis of ADHD and autism. And so essentially all of these odd socks were like Ebony's contrary quirks. And now I'm like, oh, and there's a new filing system. Like someone's like pulled this cabinet, it's a wonky cabinet inside of me. And now all of those things that had nowhere to go have somewhere to go. And so there's a level of acceptance and a level of like relief on the inside that comes from that.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think what you're speaking to, not to generalize it, but I think for a lot of people getting diagnosed, like having a late diagnosis, it can be really freeing and empowering because it is like this missing component. And then when you have it, it connects a lot of different dots and sort of expands the picture, right?
100%. And I'm fine for that to be a generalization. I think there's also a piece of grief. There's also, but like this is true of any change, right?
Right.
So for me, the other framework that I lean on is human design, and understanding that I'm a manifesting generator has given me a huge amount of acceptance, because I'm like, well, and this is why I do human design for neurodivergence, because I can see where certain operating system quirks play out in each individual person's design. And so for me, rather than it being something I want to medicate or eradicate, when we can bring those things into balance and when they're working in alignment, then it's just an operating system. I actually think it's part of evolution, you know, and it's the world that needs to change and not us. The world is not fit for purpose. It's got all of these antiquated systems, days of the week, 9 to 5, like all of these structures that were
Right.
made for people that don't exist anymore. Like we've evolved. And so the world outside of us needs to evolve. And as I'm saying that and like talking to you, I'm like, well, that then has some kind of correspondence for this inner validation, right? Because the world out there is changing so fast.
Right.
You think about the amount that has changed in our lifetime. I sometimes like to remind myself that the television didn't exist when my dad was a child, and he is not that much older than me, right? Like, that's insane for that amount of like change in a human's lifetime. And so for us to be validating ourselves on stuff on the outside that's changing so fast is actually crazy. It makes much more sense to trust what's going on in here, surely.
Right. To work with your system. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of to rewind back what you're saying a little bit.
Yeah.
This is making me think of when I was describing self-leadership or inner validation and
Yeah.
the importance of it when it comes to neurocomplexity or neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that, this is just my own like personal opinion, but I think there's always going to be that tension between our internal system and the world around us. And I'm such an idealist too. I'm an ENFP and a generator, and like I live for ideals, and like I'm always optimistic toward that, and um have like a lot of integrity with that. But with that being said, I think that tension is always going to exist. I don't know if perfect balance and harmony is possible with things outside of us at any given time. I think we can strive for that, but my experience as a psychotherapist and just like walking through my own life is that there always is that tension there. Um, and but I think you maximize the chances of harmony when like you're okay in here. And I think also to rewind it back to talking about my experiences in residential treatment and with the clinical medical model, I've like had this tension in my career where my background is for 10 years, I was a yoga teacher and I taught Sanskrit and I would go to different studios and implement different programs. I had a studio briefly before COVID and kind of came from this free-spirited, wooey place and realized I wanted to do certain kinds of work with people that, at least in the States, required certain kinds of training, licenses, et cetera. And I've often contemplated actually just pursuing coaching with IFS since the model speaks to me so much. But I recognize that in choosing that, I would leave a large number of people without access to certain things of the model, certain parts of the model. And so this is a very long-winded way of me, I guess, sharing that I've had this tension as a therapist for a long time. I think I'm going to live with it for the rest of my career because I'm up against the clinical medical model. And there are parts of that model that are very harmful, that have historically been harmful, and I believe actively in some ways do cause harm. For example, in the DSM, we still don't have an actual diagnostic category for CPTSD, even though it's recognized by the World Health Organization. So if a client's displaying certain symptoms, we'll slap them with a personality disorder diagnosis. which doesn't give them access to certain kinds of trauma therapies and whatnot.
Mm.
Um, but learning like how to speak for my needs professionally and also learning how to operate in that space of tension has been really impactful.
Mhm.
I don't know what more to say about it, but somehow that's connecting with what you're speaking
And
to.
it is, it's so important, right? Because in the work that I do, in the way that I work with what I call the value filter, which really is like this internal compass, and it's a tool for interoception for people who have alexithymia, or who are like, I don't have feelings, or I can't, you know, or my proprioception is really bad, or whatever it is, or who don't even have any of those intellectual thoughts because they haven't lived in a world where that's a possibility for them, right? One of the things that I do is I work with static and dynamic energies. I work with feminine and masculine energies, or whether we call that yin and yang, or sun and moon and warrior healer, right? So we've got these different tones or qualities of energy within us. And polarity, or friction, or conflict, or tension is what creates growth. It's what changes the world. It's part of the, like, oh, in the one hand, we've got like this fire, right? This active arrow, singular focus. And then we've got this like womb, like uberous energy of the feminine, right? And together they create beautiful attraction, or like horrific conflict sometimes. But that's where then we get into like conception and birth, and also death and rebirth, right? Like the really Kali Ma energy that is really pushed away from polite society. Like no one wants to see that bit of destruction before the new comes through, or the like really barren landscape, or that integration period, or any of those things. And so I think doing this work, having these conversations, allows us to hold a whole universe within us. That means that when we face conflict, or when we face situations that are uncomfortable, or that we don't agree with, or that trigger us in some way, there's some language for it, some capacity for it, and some spaciousness maybe.
Exactly. That's so well said. I just want to underline that and put a period at the end of that and make that the whole title of this episode, what you just said.
No idea what that was, but yes, that. that okay, before we do actually wrap it up and move into like a light-hearted, a light-hearted quick fire round within the Patron part, where I'm just going to ask you some really nosy questions. Is there anything else that you want to talk to, of the kind of the theme of what it is that we've been talking about?
Just that I think I would expand upon what you just said with the spaciousness, the ability to be with the tensions of the pairs of opposites builds capacity. I think there's something deeply creative about that. And that process can also be one that offers grace. And sometimes it is messy when we're connecting with certain tensions or certain archetypes or certain energies in our life. Like the nature of it is it might feel chaotic, but if we allow that chaos, it can be a process of grace and calm and ease. And that's sort of how I see maturation and adulting, is that, you know, if devastation visits me in my life, crisis visits me in my life, my parts don't activate as much around it. It's like, of course I'm going to grieve. Of course I'm going to be scared. But like that ability to kind of soothe myself by naming what is there. And that's really kind of like the message I want to offer with IFS and parts work, is it's not necessarily doing this abstract inner dialoguing work where you go down and find like your biggest, deepest trauma. Like that can be part of it, but it also can just be a very gentle, intuitive process. You know, you're doing parts work, like I said, if you're journaling, if you're speaking for your experience, if you're being with yourself. And I just want to make sure that listeners know that they can access that where they are right now.
Thank you for that. Me too. And I think the point of my desire to have this conversation is so that there are, I believe, a lot of people who are in my audience, in my sphere, and maybe in yours as well, who have a kind of philosophy or a sensation, a belief, a way of living life view of animus and everything, right? Like I speak to flowers and the moon, and like there's this animus energy, right? And if you are one of those people and you've enjoyed this conversation, the likelihood is that IFS and parts work is a model that is going to work for you, because there are so many talking therapies that have been a waste of my life. Whereas if we're somebody who has these multiple parts anyway, and recognizes them and has access to that, I think it's a really super powerful tool. And you can come, it's built into all my programs, but in a very kind of, I won't tell you you're eating your vegetables kind of a way. And if there is something specific that you want to work on, please go and work with Sarah. I have spent a lot of time looking at her website, reading her articles, feeling into her energy. And I think it's really important in this day and age to have recommendations and to have like nuance within us of like, who would I go to if I want to actually do a piece of work on this, or around that. So yeah, I just wanted to share that as well. And I'm going to put all of your links and information in the show notes so that they're really, really easy for people to click through to. But if people want to come and follow you, where's the best place to come and say hey or see what you're up to?
Yeah, so Instagram, my handle's at Sarah Ann Therapy, and without the E.
Perfect. Well, like I said, I'm going to make sure all the links are there. Thank you so much for just coming and having a free-flowing conversation with me. It means a lot.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for your thoughtful questions and dialogue. I really enjoyed it.